A reading from Matthew. But about that day and hour, no one knows, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. For as the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away. So too will it be for the coming of the Son of Man. Then two will be in the field, one will be taken, and one will be left. Two women will be grinding meal together, one will be taken, and one will be left. Keep awake, therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But understand this: if the owner of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. This seems to be kind of a strange reading to have right in the middle of Advent as we're getting ready for Christmas. All of a sudden, we hear Jesus talking about the end of the world. And I had a theory about this reading for a while. I think that maybe all those years ago when they decide which Bible readings get read on which days in the season of the church, that there was somebody who just really liked this reading. It was like their favorite Bible verse. And when the day came for them to pick where it goes, they picked their first week and it wasn't available. It was already filled in. And they looked across the calendar and all of them were taken except for this spot right before Christmas. And rather than changing the reading to be something more, about getting ready for baby Jesus, they just threw it in anyway. And now all of us pastors have to figure out what this means in the middle of Advent. I changed my mind about that, though. I think there's something more to this. Actually, about 5 years ago, my mind was changed. You see, just over 5 years ago, my son Ethan was born. And at the very same time, his great-grandfather was dying. I remember getting the phone call just a week or two after bringing my son home from the hospital that said, "We really think you ought to come and see Grandpa at least one last time. It would be a good time to make a trip." And so I can remember packing the car, heading back to Indiana, and as I was driving, mentally preparing myself for this big shift, this kind of shocking change I was expecting, to go from picking up my son in the hospital to a hospice room and seeing Grandpa there. And I remember coming into his room and feeling something familiar about it. With all the preparing I did, it actually wasn't a shock at all to step into this hospice room. It felt very much like those rooms that we were in when we had our son, when he went off to the NICU and when we brought him home. So many things felt the same. So many things just seemed to fit together. There was this sense in the room that we weren't quite sure what was going to happen next, and that life was very fragile. Over the few coming weeks, I realized that these moments were linked. My son and his great-grandfather only shared time on this earth for just over a month. And when we came back to the funeral, we came to the visitation in this big, giant church with stone walls and marble floors. And about an hour into the visitation, my son wakes up from his nap and just lets out this cry that echoes and bounces off of the walls in this church. And in that moment, I don't think anybody could have said anything more powerful or more touching to the hearts of the people there than to hear that cry this new life in the midst of death. Now, that being said, my wife and I still did run to Ethan and give him his pacifier as quickly as we could. But there was something so powerful about those moments, about seeing new life and death hand in hand and seeing how they weren't so different. It was just a week or two after that funeral that many of the very same people gathered together in another church, this time for my son's baptism. And in that baptism, we heard the very same words we'd heard just a week before at the funeral. By water and the word, you have been saved from sin and raised to new life in Jesus Christ. The very same words we speak at a funeral are the ones we say when a child is baptized. That's not a coincidence. It's the same promise. The promise God makes to us in baptism is the one we hold on to at the end of life and when we don't know what comes next. It's the reason we light the very same candle when there's a baptism or a funeral, because it's the promise that God makes that holds these two things together. These two moments that could seem further apart are actually one and the same for God. That's something I learned over those few weeks when my son and his great-grandfather were both alive together. It's those moments, that moment before a newborn takes that very first breath, and that moment when a loved one takes their very last breath. Those moments are the same. They're moments that are filled with fear and uncertainty, and yet they are sacred moments. They are moments when God is at work, and when everyone in that room knows nothing that comes after will ever be the same again. This is the message we get to hear today as we hear about the end of the world and yet are waiting for God to start something brand new. That God is at work in the endings and in the beginnings and in every moment in between. So as we gather here today, as you sit here, whether you are very close to the end of something in your life or you're starting something brand new, know this: God is at work in these moments. God walks with you along your life's journey. And may God bless you this day, from your beginning to your end, and from your end to your beginning. Amen.